Skyrim is a game with a very interesting reputation. On the one hand, it's memed into absolute oblivion, with its constant re-releases and bugs and, well, being pretty well known as just an unoptimized mess that started a trend of shallow gameplay. Especially when comparing this game to like Oblivion and Morrowind, and hell, even Fallout 3, it really starts to fall apart in terms of its gameplay. The reason for this is fairly simple. Skyrim was released at the peak of games like Call of Duty, with games that were more focused on slow gameplay being more or less pushed out the door. So in order to please the Call of Duty kids, Bethesda went with a much more shallow approach to gameplay, removing things like classes and birth signs and origins in favor of more streamlined gameplay mechanics that were simpler to understand, like perks and very simple dialogue, and a story that one could very easily understand and digest. On the other hand, Skyrim is remembered as one of the best open worlds ever made, with a fantastic exploration and amazing atmosphere. So, let's take a look back and see, was Skyrim actually as good or as bad as everyone says? An open world is a term you are probably familiar with. It's a game with a very large map. The problem with this term is that there are so many games that have a big map. These games can be loosely put into a couple categories though to make it a bit simpler. A sandbox open world is where the player has a very large amount of freedom. A good example would be something like Tears of the Kingdom. A ton of freedom is given to the player not only in the fact that you can climb, glide, and swim through most obstacles, but also in the way that you can solve many puzzles and obstacles throughout the game world in various different methods. GTA 5 also uses this method of gameplay in the way that the player just has so many ways to approach objectives and puzzles. There's not really a lot of puzzles in GTA 5, but you know what I mean. An adventure open world is a term I made up to describe the idea of a game that tries to make the player more curious about the world rather than giving them large amounts of ways to deal with things, and instead of being a sandbox, it tries to force the player to explore out of curiosity. Many games aim for this, and for a good reason. It's really friggin' fun. But many, and I really do mean many games, seem to mess this up. A good example of this is The Witcher 3. Many locations in The Witcher 3 are simply marked on the player's map, basically telling the player, hey, you should go here for an objective. You should come check this out. It's not necessarily terrible, but it's not a good system at all, because it's just not a very fun way of doing things if I already know I'm going to a location. If I'm instead surprised about the place I'm going to, it's so much more fun. When I first arrived in Laonia of the Lakes, I didn't go to the floating city in the middle because I was looking for some treasure or because there was a map marker in the middle. I went there because I was interested in what the location was, and in return, you get one of the coolest moments ever as you head up the lift and find a massive friggin' floating dungeon. Making a good open world also means the player needs to have a lot of curiosity about what is actually going on in the world itself. Ancient ruins are a pretty massive cliche because they're a very simple way of doing this, and well, a very good way of doing things. They're genuinely interesting. If you want the player to be pushed towards location, the compass system from Oblivion is one of the most efficient. It doesn't work unless the player is close and actually facing the direction. There's a good chance the player was already going to find the location in the first place, it just helps them and pushes them forward. It's much more effective than just having the location on the map. Having all the locations pop up on the map is just a poor way of doing things. It's also just outright not fun. Thankfully, The Witcher 3 does a ton of things very well, but systems like this can really bring down some great games, and I really do mean bring them down a lot. So, why am I talking about these open world games? I thought this was a Skyrim review. Well, of all the games I've played, Skyrim is the only one to make me feel like I'm actually on some grand adventure and simply not walking towards some upgrade or a quest or objective. I would like to take some time to highlight my absolute favorite moment from any of the Fallout games, from Fallout New Vegas. When heading towards the Legion camp, there's a pretty good chance you stumble across a burnt barn close by. When investigating further, you will most likely find a note. This note describes how a young boy was going absolutely crazy, writing about how the cows were looking at him funny and he thought they were going to eat him. And after a while, he finally went crazy, burning down the barn with himself still inside, continuing to write down on the note about how the cows were crying out as they were annoyed that they couldn't get to him. This is such a simple location. There's no item or reward. It's just a very interesting place for this player to discover. The only game I've ever played that manages to actually do this consistently is the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. A small cabin with an old lady seems simple enough until you investigate further and find out that's actually a witch, and then you exit and are being attacked by this old lady. An ancient rune with a wooden mask that can seemingly see the past. A necromancer tapping into the souls of others to turn them into his slaves. A dog leading you to his dead master after he died of rock fever. A hunter injured after being attacked by tree spirits after hunting a bear. A man impersonating a soldier to get you to steal the ancient mask in the Nordic ruins behind him. You understand the point. The locations of Skyrim are amazing stories that are consistently different and interesting from each other. The gameplay of Skyrim is all very shallow. I established this in the intro, but the gameplay is just incredibly dumbed down to appeal to as many people as possible, which, in the end, worked decently well, I suppose. I mean, it worked really well. But it still makes me pretty disappointed to see a game that has just such a good base of gameplay in the way the combat and everything turns out, just not built on, which is very sad to see, and the fact that it's not really pushed past this point. The quests are almost the exact same. These quests are, in theory, absolutely awesome. Hunting down a man after a drinking game and seemingly wild locations of people telling you you did things you don't remember doing. Helping people to hunt down a lich after giving the town constant nightmares. A house possessed by a Daedra. Escaping a mine after being sentenced to life after investigating a corrupt government. Rebuilding an ancient dagger with the help of an evil god. Finding a man's lost brother after he's kidnapped and tortured by an opposing group. Finding a talking dog. I mean, I could go on about these quests. They're absolutely amazing. But they pose so little in terms of gameplay. I've heard people say the worst quests in Oblivion are better than the best quests in Skyrim, and well, that's not necessarily true, but it's also true at the same time. Oblivion has its share of crazy and wacky, awesome quests. Accidentally boarding a ship kidnapped by pirates, a wizard turning the townsfolk invisible, a god wanting you to mess with a town and drive them crazy. The difference is that these quests in Oblivion have more in terms of gameplay to offer the player than Skyrim does. None of the quests in Skyrim prove anything in terms of actually playing through the quests. The main quest is exactly the same. A story of an ancient dragon god coming back to life, resurrecting other dragons, and the player being tasked to go to friggin' heaven to get the aid of other heroes to help him defeat this evil dragon god. I really don't understand how you could make this boring, but they somehow did. The Civil War quest is one of the most boring quest lines in the game. The guild quest lines seem awesome, but they're all achieved by simply walking in and saying, "Hey, I'm competent." And then you become the guild master. But these quest lines have such good ideas. Helping an old man cure himself of lycanthropy, however you say that big weird word. Assassinating the emperor, finding an ancient artifact, and meeting the ancient council of mages? Like, how did they make the guild quest lines boring? They seem so awesome. Stopping the corrupt guild master and going to the ancient resting place of the Nightingales, these all seem like awesome quest lines, but just don't do anything in terms of gameplay to make themselves interesting and diverse from each other. They just feel so similar in gameplay. Nothing interesting is done to spice everything up. It's frustrating. On a better note, though, the music. Oh my goodness, the music. The soundtrack of Skyrim is on par with The Legend of Zelda, which is the highest compliment I could give a game. Jeremy Soule has created not only one of the most beautiful soundtracks I've ever heard, it's also the best in terms of how well it just fits in with the game world. Dragon fights, like the rest of the game, get boring after a couple fights, despite how cool they should be. But the music when fighting dragons is amazing, turning these battles to life, yet so quickly being able to dial back into the beautiful melody of the open world and comforting towns of town. Nostalgia is a very interesting word. It's a word you've probably heard before, but it directly correlates to a wishful desire to return to the past, often for happier or more calming memories. I don't feel nostalgic to many things, I really don't have a reason to, but Skyrim is one of those few exceptions, and the reason for that is when Skyrim is replayed, it turns into a lackluster experience with underwhelming quests, combat, and RPG elements. But the very first time playing through Skyrim is something that I will never forget, but something that I wish more than anything I could forget.